Well, good morning to everyone, and welcome to this forum. And thanks very much for being here. I'm a recovering senator, Joe Lieberman. I'm privileged to have served here in Congress for 24 years, and privileged today to be here as the convener in my role as chairman of the organization United Against Nuclear Iran, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was formed in 2008 by Ambassador Mark Wallace, who was one of our ambassadorial team at the United Nations during the Bush administration, also by the late and really great Richard Holbrooke, who served in various Democratic administrations. Dennis Ross, of course, is one of the great experts and diplomats in foreign policy, and the former CIA director, Jim Woolsey. And since that time, in various ways, for those who aren't familiar with it, the organization has worked to to urge Congress and state legislators to adopt sanctions legislation, economic sanctions against Iran, all with the singular purpose of stopping this radical extremist, expansionist, repressive regime from ever getting nuclear weapons. The second is that we have really worked and are still to put pressure on businesses to comply with the sanctions, or to let them understand the enormous risks they take and still do take if they do business in Iran, because notwithstanding the nuclear agreement that was signed in 2015, the risks, the sanctions still on in law are quite significant and powerful. So we have convened this session today and have a great group of people here with us to discuss essentially where do we go from here in our relations with Iran, and of course specifically on the nuclear file. But the fundamental reality here has changed as a result of the election. People have different reactions to different to the results of the election and the election of Donald Trump as our next president. But I will tell you, when it comes to our relations with Iran and the goal of stopping Iran from ever becoming a nuclear power, the coming of the Trump administration represents a sea change, and from my point of view, a sea change in the right direction. We're going from an administration that negotiated this Iran nuclear agreement, which I think is a bad deal, and as Donald Trump made clear during the campaign, he agrees with that. What happens now is not exactly clear, and perhaps we can have discussions that it can inform what the new administration does. But elections have consequences, and this presidential election will have significant consequences on our relations with Iran, and I believe on their quest to become a nuclear power, which to me remains the greatest threat to the United States and to our security in the world today. So it's a serious note I begin with, but I must say also a hopeful note, because I think the election moves events in a more positive direction. And of course I say that on a totally nonpartisan basis as a former supporter of Secretary Clinton. To keynote this event, we really couldn't ask for better. We have Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. She and I came to Congress in the same year, 1989. She manages still to look much younger than I. Fortunately for Florida and for America, she remains in Congress. I could say a lot about her. She's a great friend. She's been a great and principled fighter for a strong American foreign policy. She was the longtime chair and or ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, to the extent that, and I've not heard this before, the committee, when the rules meant she couldn't stay there any longer, made her the chairman emeritus of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She remains today the chair of the subcommittee on Middle East and the Middle East and North Africa, which of course make her a very significant player in where we go from here. So it's with great pride that I turn the microphone over to my dear friend, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Senator Lieberman, now the chairman of United Against Nuclear Iran, and it's an honor to be here with you, and I thank you for that very kind introduction. We miss you, yet at the same time, he never goes away. He's always here, and that's a good thing. I mean that in a positive way. But thank you to United Against Nuclear Iran. Thank you to the Foreign Policy Initiative for inviting us all to this wonderful discussion. Over the years, I've had the opportunity, the honor, really, to work with my friends at UANI, Ambassadors Wallace and Ross, Director Woolsey, and the late Ambassador Holbrooke. I'm so glad that Joe always mentions him because he is ever present as a presence in this organization. And it's been a pleasure working with Matt and Mark. They've both testified on this subject matter many times. They really know their stuff. And Alan Goldsmith, former member of our FA committee, a longtime friend of mine, is an expert on the issue of Iranian sanctions, was there on the front lines as we were writing the legislation. So thank you, Senator, for pulling us all together. As we know, Joe has been a leading voice on the threats that Iran poses to the United States and our national security interests for so many years. And we found plenty of common ground over the years to really keep pressure on Iran. And Mark and Matt have been foremost experts on sanctions laws and Iran. So you really have a treat to hear from a lot of important people. We've had the opportunity of working together to tackle some of the challenges posed by the Iranian regime, and we managed to put together a comprehensive approach to the Iranian threat, and that's a real testament to the House and the Senate and the experts in our different committees really looking at how we can best put this package of sanctions together. And we did. We put the toughest set of sanctions ever imposed against a single country, and it was passed and signed into law. Not an easy feat, and I'm confident that it was these efforts that helped cripple the Iranian economy and the Iranian regime. An international alliance was formed around the goal of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and we were well on our way. We targeted nearly every sector of the Iranian economy: oil, auto industry, aviation, banking, dual-use technology. You put it on the list, and it was check. And I'm confident that we were on our way to achieving our stated goal, preventing Iran from ever being able to acquire a nuclear weapon through the complete dismantling of its nuclear infrastructure. That was the goal. That remains the goal. Now it's been watered down, and when you hear people articulating the goal, you think, well, wait a minute, I was in part of those discussions. I don't recall that it was slowing it down or weakening it. No, it was the dismantling. That was the goal. But as we know, sanctions are only as good as their enforcement, and therein lies the problem. It was a struggle just to get the administration to go along with some of the sanctions bills that Joe and I offered, and so many other good people, and that were overwhelmingly passed in Congress. So it came as no surprise that the Obama administration was lax in its enforcement, and that's being kind. Sanctions must be fully and vigorously enforced if they are to have any impact. But even though the administration was not as tight in enforcement as it should have been, Iran's cracks were showing. So even with lax enforcement, the sanctions were having an effect. And we all know how the rest goes. The Obama administration grossly misread the purpose of the sanctions, and merely getting Iran to the negotiation table They considered that a win. We got Iran to negotiate. What? That was never the goal. That was not the end in itself, when in fact sanctions were intended to get Iran to cease its enrichment program, dismantle the program, and then they just moved the goalpost. Now we have the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and the administration has not only been doing what it can to prevent Congress from enforcing our own laws, but it has actually been out there shilling for the Iranian regime. Secretary Kerry has been trying to undermine the sanctions that we still have on the books and Congress's authority to write and enforce the laws by going to European countries, sitting down with the governments, sitting down with banks and businesses, and telling them that Iran is open for business. So we have these tough sanctions, and we have folks from the administration going out around the world and say, don't worry, you can do business with Iran. It's not a problem. How far down that rabbit hole we have gone, an administration trying to undermine U.S. law, undermine the U.S. Congress in a lobbying effort to, on behalf of a designated state sponsor of terrorism, which is what Iran is. And by the way, Iran was cheating, circumventing, obstructing, and antagonizing throughout the entire negotiation process and continues to do so. We can look the other way and we can pretend that that's not happening, but that's a fantasy. That's why it's so important that the House continues to work on Iran's sanctions bill. As you know, we recently passed a bill to block the sale of aircraft to Iran and prohibiting the Export-Import Bank from providing any assistance, directly or indirectly, to Iran and its entities. Congress also sent an extension of the Iran Sanctions Act, you know that, to the president's desk. It should be signed within the next days. And while the bill to block the sale of aircraft, so sorry about my cough, won't be signed into law by this president, we know that, it is still an important message to send to governments, to businesses, to individuals that are still considering doing business with Iran. They're just too many risks for these companies to undertake. They really need to think twice about what they're about to do. There are too many unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld would say, too many known unknowns. And it's a great phrase that those seeking to do business with Iran would take. Are you willing to put your company at risk? It's something that they need to think about. And I know that this wonderful organization, UANI, has done a great job in educating companies on why they should not do business with Iran. Sometimes we see, the panel discussions and the briefings, and the public and you, interested parties, don't see the work behind the scenes. They're so knowledgeable of the sanctions laws, and they are willing to meet with business leaders and the CEOs and tell them, this is what's at stake. Is this a worthy investment for you? And I can say that the next Congress will continue our oversight, will continue to hold Iran accountable for its illicit activities. We're not going to be willing to look the other way because of a small infraction, thinking, oh, well, if we take them to task on that, they could walk away from the deal. We're not scared of that. And we won't be as willing as the current administration to give the regime a pass or to give those who have been supporting the regime a pass either. It's a whole new ballgame. And as Joe said, we don't know yet what President-elect Trump will do as he scrutinizes the JCPOA, but we do know that we have a better chance at strictly enforcing current sanctions, which is what we want, enforcing current sanctions, expanding the other non-nuclear related sanctions, and perhaps even rolling back or tightening provisions of the JCPOA. A lot could happen. Maybe nothing will happen. We will soon find out. But Congress is very eager to do something about this non-enforcement. And all of this should be enough to give anyone trying to do business with Iran enough reason to pause and think about their options. Is it worth it for my company to do this? That is, if they haven't already been turned off business with Iran from the 3+ decades of an Iranian regime that has proven time and time again that it cannot be trusted. How many times can they prove it? And until you say, well, maybe they're trying to send me a message. Maybe they mean this. Or from the very real possibility that every dollar that they help bring into Iran's economy has a strong chance of being used to helping that country fund terror, possibly opening up that company up for liability because of that terror. So you can be sure that in the next Congress, we will place an increasingly high importance on scrutinizing those that seek to do business with Iran. Our message is not going to be Iran is open for business. It's going to be careful when if you do business with Iran. Now we have the JCPOA. The administration has not only been doing what it can to prevent Congress from enforcing our own laws, but has actually been out there, as we know, doing that business. And Congress is not going to take this lightly. As I said, we're considering sanctions extensions on certain sectors of the Iranian economy. We want to see what we can do about broadening the scope of the sanctions to cover IRGC-controlled businesses. And we know that those military units are controlling the businesses, to include subsidiaries that are not wholly or majority owned, or those that have IRGC members on their boards. And that's incredible. Businesses that will have these terrible military folks on their boards. And of course, there's a great risk to a company's reputation for doing business with a state sponsor of terrorism. We've sort of taken that stigma away, and it's not a badge of dishonor. It's like, who cares? State sponsor of terrorism, it's no problem. Let's put that stigma back on. And I think it's clear that we're about to enter a new phase of Iranian sanctions. We cannot emphasize that enough to those wishing to do business with Iran. It's just a bad proposition. And Iran will not be able to continue to use the JCPOA or its leverage for its continued illicit behavior. President-elect Trump has already made that clear, especially through some of his recent appointments. Mike Pompeo, my good friend, I served with him on Intel as CIA director. Look at the statements he has made about the Iranian deal. As we know, the defense secretary nomination, General Flynn, National Security Advisor, and my former staff director on Foreign Affairs Committee, Yelene Poblet, who's serving on the National Security Council landing team. So these are folks who are well-versed on Iran's illicit behavior, no sanctions laws, and Congress has certainly signaled its intent to get tougher on Iran. So we have a new president who's got a national security team that's very tough on Iran. We've got a new Congress that's going to get tougher on Iran, and that means getting tougher on those doing businesses with Iran, because we want to remind these businesses that Iran continues to be a state sponsor of terrorism. So we will see a flurry of Iran-related activities early in the new year, and I think we have an opportunity to undo a lot of the problematic concessions that we have seen over the last few years, and I can't wait. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you to all of you. Now I'm going to do my 1 minute on the floor.
Thank you.
All right. Muchas gracias, amigo. I've been coughing. I'll give you an elbow. Thank you so much. It's going to be a new year, and it's going to be good.
It's going to be good.
All right. Thank you. And Joe, I know that you said you were an early supporter of Hillary, and I'll tell you, I'm looking forward to the new term. And I'm a person who was not with Trump and did not vote for Trump. Right. I put Jeb Bush, but we have our president. Yeah. We know where he stands, and he's going to go get him, and I'm eager to join it.
So it's a new day, really, and a brighter day. Let me just thank you for coming by and offering those words. And they remind us of the critical role that Congress has, the powers Congress has under the Constitution with regard to foreign policy. And when it comes to our policy toward Iran, particularly the sanctions, really Congress, led by people like you, Ileana, has driven the debate. And we've always struggled, usually, regardless of the party of the president, on sanctions with an administration that kind of resisted them and then accepted the fact that there were overwhelming bipartisan majorities. They became law, and then really we have to give credit to the administrations through the Treasury Department, enforce them well. But now we've got I think a continuing bipartisan anti-Iran, pro-sanctions majority in Congress, and we've got a president and an administration sympathetic, more than sympathetic, maybe even ahead of the congressional consensus on the threat represented. So,
It's going to be a brand new world.
amen. Take care,
Thank you,
sweetheart.
guys.
Be well.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day. We're going to move over to the sort of panel part of this. FBI is a co-sponsor today, and I really regret that I did not mention that, the Foreign Policy Initiative, because it's led and has been really built up by my former, I'm proud to say, Legislative Director Chris Griffin, who's here. And if there are any congressional staff in the room, I do want to say to you that once a staff to a member, always a staff to a member, because Chris, really, God bless him, arrived with exactly the cup of coffee he knew I would need this morning. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Alan Goldsmith to moderate the panel.
Thank you very much, Senator Lieberman. And as a recovering congressional staffer myself, I couldn't agree more with what you just said. And I do want to thank our friends at the Foreign Policy Initiative for co-sponsoring today's panel. In particular, I want to note the presence of Christopher Griffin, David Adesnik, Lindsay Markle, and Zvi Kahn from FPI, who are joining us today, as well as my United Against Nuclear Iran colleagues, Jason Brodsky, Stephen Cohen, Jennifer Kastner, and Daniel Roth. So we will now begin our panel discussion on, and I just want to frame the discussion this way. What can and should Congress and the incoming administration do on Iran? What might the Iranian regime itself do? And in light of these factors, what are the risks for companies considering doing business in Iran? So we're honored to have three powerhouse Iran experts today. Senator Joseph Lieberman, our chairman of United Against Nuclear Iran, needs no introduction. He's been a leader in working across party lines to protect our national security and to support American leadership in the world. Now senior counsel at Kasowitz, Benson, Torres, and Friedman in New York. Senator Lieberman served for 24 years as a member of the U.S. Senate from Connecticut. And I'd note that at the end of his service in January 2013, almost 4 years ago, he was chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee and a senior member of the Armed Services Committee. And he was also 10 years service in the Connecticut State Senate and 6 years as Connecticut's Attorney General. And last but not least, in 2000, he was, of course, the Democratic candidate for Vice President of the United States. Mr. Mark Dubowitz is Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a Washington, D.C.-based nonpartisan policy institute where he leads projects on Iran, sanctions, countering threat finance, and nonproliferation. He is an expert on Iran's global network, including the regime's nuclear, terrorist, missile, and cyber threats to the United States and other allies, and is widely recognized as one of the key influencers in shaping sanctions policies to counter the threats emanating from Iran and its surrogates. Mr. Dubowitz has a master's degree in international public policy from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies and law and MBA degrees from the University of Toronto. Mr. J. Matthew McInnis is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Iran, specifically its intentions, strategic culture, military power, and goals. He also works on U.S. defense and regional security issues in the Persian Gulf and on the effectiveness of the U.S. intelligence community. Before joining AEI, Mr. McInnis served as a senior analyst and in other leadership positions for the U.S. Department of Defense. Mr. McInnis has a master's degree in international relations from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and another master's degree in European Studies from New York University, and a bachelor's degree in International Studies from Eckerd College in Florida. And Senator Lieberman, thank you again. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Alan. Let me try to set in context, I guess I already have in part. This organization worked very hard to both pass the sanctions and make sure that businesses were complying with them. And we believe, and of course we weren't alone, there was a lot of effort on this, most especially from the U.S. Treasury Department, that those sanctions were really impacting, hurting the Iranian economy, and in some sense threatening the regime because of the unrest that was there, which in part was caused by economics. This was a tremendous source of strength to us, and if they wanted it, the other great powers in the P5+1. UANI feels that we squandered that strength in the negotiations that led to the Iran nuclear agreement, and ended up with a deal that it didn't do nothing, as one of my friends in Connecticut politics used to say. It didn't do nothing, but it did put some limits on their program right now. But it gave them an enormous amount of cash immediately. You can argue whether it was $100 billion or $150 billion. We know what they're going to use it for, which is to both strengthen their repressive regime and to support their terrorist proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, you name it. And then the big point after that, and remember, we are united against nuclear Iran. The Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, legitimizes Iran's access to become a nuclear power after a certain number of years. Well, you can argue whether it's 8 or 10 or 12 or 15, but that's what it does. And that is a looming threat, a sword over the head of the Middle East, but also as Iran continues to develop ballistic missile capacity, a sword over our heads and our security as well. UANI strongly opposed the Iran nuclear agreement, JCPOA, worked very hard to try to get Congress to reject it. In a way, the rules of the game were stacked against us from the beginning, because once the president decided, as it was his authority and precedent supported him doing, that this was not a treaty but a kind of executive agreement, we needed to get to two-thirds as opposed to him needing to get to two-thirds to ratify a treaty, and we just couldn't do it. Also, the fact is the president also lobbied more intensely, I believe, President Obama, on this matter than he has on anything else, including Obamacare, that his administration brought before Congress. And so that's all changed now. And I will say that in that fight over the rejection of JCPOA in Congress, we saw a very troubling break in the bipartisan effort in Congress directed to stopping Iran from becoming a nuclear power and becoming expansionist, and or stopping its expansionism and repression. A lot of that had to do with the president's personal commitment to this, Secretary Kerry's, et cetera. I think we're now back at a point, and the extension of the Iran Sanctions Act shows it very clearly, where we're going to reconstitute the bipartisan anti-Iran majority consensus here in Congress. What is different, of course, is that, as I said earlier, we have a president coming in, President-elect Trump, who really said agrees with us, UANI, that the Iran nuclear agreement was a bad deal for America. And we think, as Mark Wallace and I said in a op-ed that was put up on the Washington Post site last night, that one, we're grateful for the president-elect's position. Two, we think he's got a lot of tools in his toolkit, and a lot of strength, because he's new and frankly he's unpredictable for the Iranians and for our allies in the P5+1. So we hope first that the administration will focus on enforcement of the existing act, and to point out that Iran has already broken some of its terms, particularly with regard to heavy water and the development of its ballistic missile capacity. Secondly, to point out that while the Obama administration and Secretary Kerry frequently argued that the agreement was worth the compromises in it because it was the best hope for moderating the transforming the Iranian regime, we now have more than a year, almost a year and a half since the Iran nuclear agreement was at least signed in the first instance, and the anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-Arab rhetoric and policies, expansionist policies of this administration in Tehran, repressive actions toward their people have simply continued unabated. The newspaper today that I read talked about President Rouhani apparently worried that he's the moderate, allegedly, that he's not been strong enough, was very tough on the President-elect Trump and protective of the agreement. And he raised a rhetorical question to a crowd, I think, at a university in Tehran. Will we accept changes to the Iran nuclear agreement? The answer was not no. The answer was chanting of death to America. I mean, that's who we're dealing with. We can't close our eyes and our ears. So I think the options here are to enforce the current agreement and begin to sit first with our allies. I mean, not first, actually. I wouldn't sit first with our allies in the P5+1. I do what the Obama administration did not do. This is my respectful suggestion to the incoming administration, and that is to sit with our allies who are Iran's neighbors and who have most equities, life at stake in this Iran nuclear agreement, and that means the Arab states and Israel, and coordinate a position with them, then go to the P5+1 and go back and try to renegotiate the agreement on terms that are better for us and that will be more transformational, really, on paper, not just as a hope that, look, if Iran becomes a more civil state and stops repression and moves back from its expansion and stops supporting terrorism, of course we can have normal relations with them. If my friend John McCain were here, he'd say, on that day, I promise you pigs will fly. So he has a way with the language that's really quite colorful. It may be that at that point, after trying a diplomatic path and enforcing the current agreement, President Trump's administration will want to do what he said he would do during the campaign, which is to tear up the agreement. And I think that threat, that fear, ought to be in the minds of the leadership of Iran and our allies in the P5+1, because up until now, they have acted, and Ayatollah Khamenei said this, acted as if we wanted the agreement more than the Iranians did. That's never a good way to go into negotiations. So, okay, we have a president who wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, and I think he has the potential and the right attitude to renegotiate this to be a better deal or to tear it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lieberman. Before I turn over the floor to our next speaker, I just note we may be joined shortly by a special guest from Congress, and if and when, and so we are. We're very pleased today to be joined by the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Eliot Engel of New York, and we welcome him. Ranking Member Engel, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Good thing I've been doing this a long time, because I don't need much time to get ready. Let me first of all say it's certainly a pleasure to be with you, and I'm grateful for all your hard work, and your expertise and advocacy have helped show why it's so important to keep the pressure up on Iran even in the wake of a nuclear agreement, and I'm happy to share my thoughts. As you know, I didn't support the Iran deal. I voted against it. I was one of only 25 Democrats to do so out of 190. I voted against it not because I took pleasure in voting against it, but from the very beginning, I was, as ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, privy to all the classified briefings from the moment the negotiations started till the end, which was about a year and a half later. And the very first, I told this story the other day, at the very, very first briefing that we had, I asked a very simple question, and it was, when we are sitting and negotiating with Iran, are we requiring that they stop spinning centrifuges or stop enriching uranium while we're talking? The answer, I was told, was no. And I said no, so they're going to continue to enrich while we're negotiating with them? And they said yes. And I said, well, that doesn't sound very right. You know, why is this? Why didn't we demand it? Well, Iran, we mentioned it, but Iran wouldn't agree to it. And I said, well, if Iran won't agree to something like this, what does that show you about their intentions down the line? So I was a skeptic from day one because of that answer that I got, which was really not very satisfactory. And then in the ensuing weeks and months, and we had many, many briefings, we were told, and the frustration was that Iran, we could only talk about the nuclear deal, the nuclear program in Iran, that we couldn't discuss about their sponsoring of terrorism or their ballistic missile programs or any of the other bad things that they do. And it's frustrating sitting there and you sort of have the, you know, the parameters, and you just can't say anything else. And even though we were told that nothing else could be put in the deal, we found out a year and a half later that there were things, goodies put in the deal that Iran wanted, involving them procuring missiles and other things like that, ballistic missiles. So it became clear to me that we wanted an agreement much more than the Iranians wanted an agreement. And of course, when you have a situation like that, they dig in their heels and they bargained for a tough deal. Now, when I finally saw the results, I can give you lots of reasons why I didn't like it, but there were really two. And I told this to the president when he called me into the Oval Office and asked me to support the deal. Number one, Iran came to the table because of sanctions, which we all passed in the Congress. The sanctions is really what brought them to the table. Their economy was hurting. Their currency was worthless. They have a restive young population in Iran who couldn't get jobs and couldn't do anything that young people would like to do. And they were worried. They really were worried. And so they had no money, so they couldn't do anything. But despite the fact that they were sanctioned and had no money, they still somehow managed to be the #1 state sponsor of terrorism during that time. And so it doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to understand that if, when they had no money and they were struggling and they were suffering and their regime was in jeopardy, they still managed to be the #1 sponsor of terrorism with their proxy Hezbollah, which Israel only knows too well in Lebanon. Imagine what they could do in terms of international terrorism if they got billions and billions of dollars with this Iran deal. That was a non-starter for me. I don't want to put any more money in the pockets of the mullahs and those people who are oppressing their own people, let alone vow to wipe Israel off the map and do all the other things. You know, the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan is Israel. And of course, the ink wasn't even dry in any kind of agreement when 3 days later, the Ayatollah led a chant in Tehran in the streets yelling, "Death to America, death to Israel." So what does that show you about any kind of good faith? So we ought to not be under any illusion that there's any kind of good faith. So that was the one thing that bothered me the most, putting more billions of dollars, more money into the pockets of Iran and let them continue their miserable record of being the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. The second thing is, although the deal purported to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, if you read the deal, it does no such thing. It only postpones it for 15 years. Now, I'm glad it's postponed for 15 years. That's a good accomplishment. But to me, it's not enough in terms of making a deal. the destruction of a lot of the Iranian plants would have been much better. Right now they're disabled, but they could get them back online in a relatively short period of time. So to me, 2030 comes around very quickly. It's already 2017 in another month. And so in 2030, Iran will be a nuclear threshold state, and there'll be nothing we can do to stop it because it will have abided by the agreement. So it was easy for me. I could go on, but those two were just killers for me. Now, look, the president is very sincere about what he feels this deal does. And I said to him, I hope I'm proven wrong, and I hope you're proven right, because none of us wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon. The president certainly doesn't. It's just a matter of what you do. But I think now we've got to be very careful when we talk about destroying the Iranian deal, because we have already provided Iran with billions and billions of dollars. I want them to now provide us with their responsibilities under that deal. And right now I'm concerned, and it's a concern of mine, and I'm going to delve into it and look at it greater, that if we were to blow up the deal right now, Iran would still have its cash, billions, tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions. And the things that we're asking Iran to do, they could just walk away from. So I like to say, my dear belated mother used to always talk about, my late mother used to always talk about, don't cut off your nose to spite your face. And we have to be careful that we don't do that. I'm under no illusions about this regime in Iran. I'm under no illusions about, when I hear Rouhani's a moderate, I chuckle, because he's not a moderate. He may be the most moderate of all the hardliners, but he's a hardliner. And they're all hardliners. But again, we have to do what's good for the United States and our allies, and we have to make sure that the Iranians fulfill every single commitment they made under that deal. So that's the story about the Iran deal. So I'm not going to read my speech because I just told you what happened. We need to monitor as a Congress what the Iranians are doing. When they sent up their ballistic missiles with writing on it in Hebrew saying death to Israel, they didn't technically break the JCPOA agreement, but they did break Security Council resolutions in the United Nations. And, I'm a New Yorker. My good friend Joe Lieberman is now a New Yorker, a constituent of mine, by the way. And let me just say that if I can do a quarter of the job that Joe Lieberman was able to do for so many years, I will have fulfilled a great accomplishment, because there was nobody who was more steadfast and clearer and more brilliant on these issues than Joe Lieberman. I'm proud to call him friend, and I'm proud to say that we all look to him when we conduct business such as this, because Joe is smart, steady, competent. You just know his word is his bond, and at a time in Capitol Hill when everybody's fighting with everybody else, you just need stalwarts like Joe Lieberman. And it's a loss that he's not here, but a loss to the country. But we still get him involved a little bit back in Riverdale in New York. So I think I'll stop, because I know you've heard a lot of things, but I just want to tell you that it's we've got to do this on a bipartisan basis. We cannot allow the Iranians to divide the parties. We need to work together to make sure that the Iranian threat is dissipated. The United States, people of the United States, and the people of Iran are not enemies. In fact, I talk to my friends who have roots in Iran, and they tell me that the population there admires the United States and admires what we've been able to do, and they want us to take firm stands, and we need to do it. And we can't roll over, and we can't want an agreement more than the other side wants an agreement and expect to get a fair agreement that does the kinds of things that we want to see it done. So I want to thank you for all you do to focus attention, for all the, the smart people here who understand the issue, and we're going to just keep fighting it. It's got to be done, again, in a bipartisan way. I don't want Iran to become a partisan issue. Iran poses a threat to the United States and to the world, and the way we're going to handle it is in a bipartisan way together. We can't use it as a political football, because that's the wrong thing to do. As the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, my chairman is Ed Royce of California. He and I work more closely together than I believe any chairman or ranking member on any other committee in the House of Representatives work. We do it because we believe that politics needs to stop at the water's edge. When we're talking about international diplomacy, we're Americans. We're not hyphenated Americans or Democratic Americans or Republican Americans. We're Americans. And the people that wish to do our country harm don't care what political party we belong to. They want to do our country harm. So we have to work together, and we've done that on the Foreign Affairs Committee with people from all different points of view. We try to sit down first. We try to hash things out. And if we get to a point where 80% of people are satisfied, then I think we've done our job. And I'll point out one last thing as an example. We had a bill that heavily sanctioned Iran back in the summer of 2013. It didn't become law because the Senate unfortunately never passed it. Joe wasn't in the Senate then, but if he was, he would have been the main guy. We passed it out of the Foreign Affairs Committee unanimously. Not a dissident vote from either side of the aisle, because we worked it out behind closed doors and did it. And it passed on the floor with only 8 no negative votes. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 20 negative votes. It was 20. It was 400 to 20 negative votes. That's a real accomplishment, and that's the kind of things that we should be doing beyond politics. So I want to thank you for keep bringing this issue to the fore. It's something that the American people need to keep knowing about, and we should be under no illusions about Iran, no illusions about moderates or somehow or other we're going to talk with them and it's going to embolden the moderates. The moderates are put down, summarily killed. There have been more trials since that deal, more people killed than I care to think about, more people killed by the regime. We need to keep speaking out, and you do that, and so I thank you for it. Thanks a lot.
If I may, Alan, thanks. Just to thank Eliot really for his leadership consistently, and the relationship between Eliot Engel and Ed Royce is exactly what Eliot has described, and has been critically important on this issue and so many others in foreign policy, and will continue to be, and now particularly to come back to what we've been stressing, because there is going to be a president who basically shares our point of view about the unacceptability of the Iran agreement. My wife and I moved to Riverdale following the what we call the migratory pattern of grandparents, because it's in Riverdale that we found the greatest concentration of children and grandchildren. But a big bonus to that move was that Eliot Engel is our representative in Congress, which makes me very proud and grateful. Thank you. Alan, all yours.
Thank you very much.
To stay or to, if you have to go, we understand.
I'm going to run, but again, I want to thank you and look forward to working with you. And I know Joe and I have been throwing compliments at each other, but I have to tell you, he's actually the best. I'm a poor, wannabe replica, but he's the best.
You're a bee. Take care. See you in the neighborhood.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Engel. Thank you, Senator Lieberman. And now we'll turn it over to Mr. Dubowitz.
Great. Well, thanks, Alan and Senator Lieberman, Congressman Engel, and Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen, and certainly UANI and FBI. I just want to say right off the bat, 2 phenomenal organizations that have played a huge role in getting us to where we are on the Iran issue, and I really look forward to working with both organizations next year and in the 115th Congress and this new administration. I'm going to jump right in. I think folks here have really pointed out the fundamental flaws with this nuclear deal. the sunset provisions that allow Iran a patient pathway to nuclear weapon. I mean, it's worth remembering the Iranians don't have to cheat. All they have to do is be patient, and these restrictions will just tick away, actually beginning in 4 years when the arms embargo goes, in 7 years when the missile embargo goes. They're already working on advanced centrifuge R&D today on advanced models that are more powerful. You need fewer numbers. They're therefore easier to hide. It gives them an easier clandestine sneak out option. And they're, as everybody said, they're going to have an industrial-sized nuclear program. I would argue they already have an industrial-sized nuclear program, but it's going to be bigger and more expansive. And they're going to have near-zero nuclear breakout, as the president himself has admitted. And so imagine Iran in 8 to 10 years from now. This is the same Iranian regime, the same state sponsor of terrorism, with a nuclear weapons capability, an ICBM program, regional dominance, potentially at $1 trillion economy, given 4 or 5% growth rates, and an economy that's going to be increasingly immunized against our ability to use sanctions. So that's a very dangerous Iran. It's an even more dangerous and hardened Iran than the Iran we face today. And my fear has always been that at that point we'll only have two options. One is to concede Iran a nuclear weapon, or to use military force against a much more powerful and dangerous Iran really poised at the edge of nuclear weapons breakout. So that's the fundamental problem with that deal. It's also a deal where we've gained some inspection rights, but we don't have the ability to actually physically inspect Iranian military sites. We weren't even able to get physically onto the Parchin site where Iran has conducted weaponization experiments. My colleague Ros-Lehtinen at FDD, who was a former Deputy Director General of the IAEA for safeguards, has told me time and time again, and he's inspected Iran's program and North Korea's program. If you can't get boots on the ground, IAEA boots on the ground, into military sites, then you have no visibility into Iran's weaponization activities. And so it's just a fundamental flaw of the deal. All right, so the question is, we all recognize, or many of us recognize, a fundamentally flawed deal. What do we do about it? And let me just offer some concrete suggestions, particularly on sanctions. I agree absolutely with the Washington Post op-ed that Senator Lieberman and Ambassador Wallace wrote. I wish I had written it, but I'm very pleased they did. And I think that right out of the gate, I think it's wise for this administration not to abrogate the deal from day one, but to actually use our ability under the deal, particularly in non-nuclear sanctions, what the administration itself has admitted are not inconsistent with the JCPOA, to begin to address Iran's malign activities outside the deal and inside the deal. And I'll talk about both. On the outside the deal, Iran is clearly accelerating their malign activities on terrorism, on missiles. They're taking our citizens hostage. They're harassing our ships, our helicopters. They are firing off ballistic missiles, and their human rights abuses have only accelerated since the JCPOA, without any response from this administration that's had no human rights designation since the JCPOA was introduced, and has only had 3 since Rouhani was selected as Iran's president in 2013. So we have the ability to use non-nuclear sanctions in some very powerful ways, and with the theme of this discussion and the theme of UANI's work on business risk, we have the ability to create what used to be called in the high-tech sector FUD, right? This was fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It was very much a technique that Microsoft used, for those of you who remember, in order to create uncertainty in the marketplace. And I think Donald Trump's election is an election of FUD. I mean, the president himself is creating tremendous fear and uncertainty and doubt, both from adversaries and from allies. And I think that's actually a strategic weapon to be used in this attempt to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. What would I do if I had congressional authority, which I don't? But I would certainly mandate that the administration has 30 to 60 days to designate the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. They're currently not designated for terrorism. The Quds Force is designated, but the Revolutionary Guards are not. And that designation could take place under Executive Order 13224, or they should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Then, and this may come as a surprise to many of you, there are only 25 IRGC companies that have ever been designated by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the Treasury, despite the fact that my organization has identified 575 IRGC companies that are eligible for designation based on majority control. And there, I can tell you, are thousands and thousands of other IRGC companies out there. So Treasury should be right off the bat in February, once everybody's in their seats, massively accelerating the number of IRGC designations from 25 to 250 to 2,500. And why is that key? It's key because the IRGC controls or has heavy influence in strategic sectors of Iran's economy. I have no problem with companies doing business in legitimate areas of Iran's economy, right? If we want to try and build up a Iranian middle class and give people the opportunity to actually do business with legitimate Iranian business people who are not connected to the regime and not connected to the Revolutionary Guards and are not engaged in malign activities, that's fine under the JCPOA. But I don't think the JCPOA ever imagined that we would be enriching the Revolutionary Guards of Iran. And they have been, to date, the main beneficiary of the JCPOA. And so designate the Rev Guards as a terrorist organization, massively accelerate the number of IRGC designations, and send a message to the Europeans and the Asians that if you're going to do business in Iran, you better be sure that your counterparty in that deal is not a Revolutionary Guard entity. And if they are, and we discover they are, then we will use the full force of U.S. financial sanctions as well as prosecutorial authority under DOJ to go after companies doing business with what will be a terrorist organization, the Revolutionary Guards. The second area that I would focus on are missiles, and instead of these highly ineffectual missile sanctions that have been imposed by the U.S. Treasury Department on procurement networks that the Iranians can easily reconstitute and are easily reconstituted, I would suggest taking a look at the legislation that was co-sponsored by Senator Eliot and Senator Rubio and others, focusing on the sectors of Iran's economy that support Iran's missile program. There are about 7 or 8 key sectors of the economy that are providing technology and parts and components for those missiles, and those entities in those sectors should be designated, and those sectors themselves should be designated if they continue to support Iran's missile program. The third, and it's not the final element because there's probably about 100 more, but I'm sure Alan is giving me a look that I should wind up quickly. So let me just do the final comment, and that is on Iran's use of the dollar. Because as this administration has acknowledged, Iran should not be allowed to process U.S. dollar transactions through the U.S. financial system. Unfortunately, the FAQs that were issued by Treasury recently allow Iran to do some kind of offshore dollarization. I think the next Treasury Department should put a stop to that immediately. Revoke the FAQs that have recently been issued. In fact, anything the administration does in the waning 44 days they have left in office, but who's counting, those should be on the top of the chopping block for the new Treasury Department. The Iranians should not be able to access and use the U.S. dollar. Right? That is absolutely unacceptable. They didn't negotiate that as part of the JCPOA, and the one thing we should not be doing is offering even more unilateral concessions to the Iranians that they even forgot to negotiate as part of the JCPOA. And I would just conclude with this. There are a number of scenarios, and I hope we talk about that, but my ideal scenario is to do what we did in the Cold War when another great Democratic senator, independently minded, Henry Jackson, who I know Senator Lieberman, I guess, knew, and certainly I think there's 2 great Democratic senators, great independents. Henry Jackson refused to bend to the Nixon administration and to the Carter administration on SALT I and SALT II, and he led an effort in Congress to have those deals renegotiated. And so there is a history in arms control agreements between the U.S. and Soviet Union to renegotiate agreements, to negotiate follow-on agreements. I can give you countless examples beyond START 1 and START 2. This notion that somehow we never renegotiate arms control agreements is absolutely erroneous. We did when the Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear tipped missiles aimed at our cities. So the idea that we can't go in and negotiate a JCPOA 2 that addresses the fundamental flaws of the first agreement and expands on some of the concerns we have, and by the way, that the Iranians still have, particularly on the economic side, is belied by the history of arms control. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Mr. Dubowitz. Mr. McInnis.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, UANI and FPI for organizing this. And again, also thank you very much, Senator Lieberman, and of course Representatives Engel and Ros-Lehtinen for your excellent comments and for, again, your constant work on this extremely important issue. I've spent a lot of my time working on, especially actually since leaving government, not so much when I was in government, what we don't talk about as much, in my bio, but as some of you may know, I spent many years inside the intelligence community, and especially within the defense intelligence community, as well as serving as the senior expert for Iran at U.S. Central Command under Jim Mattis, working on particularly understanding Iran's strategic behavior, and which is a lot of what I particularly focus on, and trying to get inside the Iranian mindset and their behavior, and looking at how a potential nuclear weapon would have factored into their behavior, why they were pursuing that, and of course how they look at their support for terrorism and proxies, and their military capabilities, how that all factors into their behavior. Since leaving, of course, I try to keep a very broad outlook on how this all fits together. And I have to say, certainly Mark's comments, and as well as Senator Lieberman's, op-ed in the Post today, I fully agree with in that approach that I believe the president-elect should be taking right now. That I didn't really like the deal when it was coming down, but at this point I agree that immediate abrogation is probably not the smartest thing to do, but that we do actually have a lot of tools within the existing framework of the deal that I think can push us towards potential renegotiation to our favor. I think one of the things that's going to be very interesting to watch in observing Iranian behavior and reaction right now to our moves is what I'm trying to think through this right now of the crying wolf problem that the Iranians are going to have, because you see already from, for example, the passing and expecting signing of the extension of the Iranian Sanctions Act. You're already seeing this immediate, this is violation of the deal. We're going to walk away from it, which they're not going to do. And you're seeing that from some leaders, and you're already seeing some walking back from that from other Iranian leaders. And I think this is going to be a very interesting game, because you've seen so much of the behavior from this administration, whether it's loosening up on restrictions on using the U.S. dollar, the FAQs that Mark was mentioning, from U.S. Treasury, all these things. We're so worried that the Iranians are going to back away from the deal because they're not getting the economic benefits soon enough. We need to do all these things to to coddle the Iranians because the deal is not turning out as well as they thought on the economic front. That's been the kind of the mantra in the last year or so, ever since the deal was implemented. And I think what you're seeing is this testing of this now that they're seeing the signs from both Congress and from incoming President Trump that okay, if you do this, we're going to pull out. You're going to do this, we're going to pull out, and they're not going to do that. And I think this is going to finally kind of expose what's been true for a very long time, that, as I believe Senator Lieberman pointed out, they want this deal more than us, and they're going to keep this deal. And we've always had more leverage than they've had. And we've kind of lost a lot of that in the negotiations and in the subsequent implementation, or at least we've conceded a lot of that. And I think we can regain a lot of that back, even though it's going to be tough, because we have given away a lot in the process. So I think many of the things that have been outlined here, I think is some of the path forward on that. Though I think it is going to be difficult to get back to something what would any of us would consider to be a good deal in this situation. One of the other things that I think is going to be also important from a strategic and regional standpoint, that's going to be a challenge for the new administration, is whether how much we're going to face the security situations in the region vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, any kind of resolution that we're heading towards in Syria, how things are going to play out in Iraq after if we're succeed in Mosul. All these things involve Iran to some degree, or to a very great degree, and there were some calculations in this over the past few years, with the Iran nuclear deal and Iran strategically, that this administration did not want to really use significant leverage against Iran to achieve greater or better ends in places like Syria, because they did not want to disturb significantly what they wanted to do with the nuclear deal. Some of this was not necessarily an explicit one-for-one, but implicitly over time it became that, where I believe this White House did not want to push too hard to better resolutions in Syria, because they did not want to risk losing the nuclear deal during the negotiations. And I think that is going to become an interesting, and because of that framework, we're heading into a new administration that does want to relook at the situation that we've had with Russia and with other allies in the region. We don't quite know how that's going to play out. And so I think there are going to be some fundamental questions that, if you want to confront Iran, and I think this administration has said that, at least most of what you've seen is they want to take a strong approach to Iran. But I've also gotten the impression that they're not particularly keen on having a significant, confrontation that may lead to military conflict with Iran, or a large military conflict. A new military conflict in the region is not something that I'm sensing from the new administration. And they do want to relook at the relationship with Russia. So there are some things that have to square here, and I'm not sure how that's going to play out. And I think Putin is going to have some say in how this all plays out with where we're going to go forward on the nuclear deal. And so again, this is the real big caveat on where the administration may want to go. The other issue that I also want to point out when it comes to my final point before we go into some Q&A, I guess, is I'm all for us bringing in more pressure on Iran's support for terrorism, doing more designations on the IRGC companies, doing better missile sanctions, which I agree we need to do much more on that. The challenge that, and I discussed this in some of my Senate Foreign Relations Committee testimony yesterday, and trying to discern better how Iran approaches these things from its perspectives on strategy and existential approaches to deterrence and other issues. One of the things the real frustration at times in trying to get Iran to the table on any of these issues is that the nuclear program, as important as it is to Iran never actually got a weapon or was actually at the point of holding or about to have a weapon. It obviously was trying to get closer, wanted to have the capability to have one. Because it did not have one yet, it was not part of Iran's deterrent or strategic capability. And therefore, it was not an existential capacity of Iran's yet. Unlike Iran's missile program, unlike Iran's use of proxies, like Lebanese Hezbollah, which are essential for Iran to deter Israel and us, Saudi Arabia. So things like the missile program, things like its support for terrorism and support for proxies, those things are extremely important to Iran, even more so than the nuclear program. Because of that, it's going to take a lot more pressure from us and from the international community and from our partners in the region to be able to bring them to the table on those issues, to get them to truly back off on those, unless there is actually, as Senator McCain was saying, when those pigs fly, and there's real ideological change inside Tehran. And when that happens, then that will change. But as long as those same guys are running things in Tehran, they're going to keep doing this stuff. And now that doesn't mean that we should be doing whatever we can to mitigate this and prevent it and to disrupt it and to put gums in the works and do whatever we can. We should absolutely do that. But as a caveat, I try to remind people that whatever we did to get them to the table on the nuclear program, if you want to do the same thing to actually get them to give up to some degree the missile program or some degree give up support to proxies and terrorism, you're going to have to double that. You're going to have to triple that. You're going to have to quadruple that kind of pressure. And it's just the sad, I think is kind of the sad truth about it. At the same time, we should still try to do what we can. So with that, I'll stop and we can do questions.
Thank you all very much for your comments. I wanted to start by following up on one of Mr. McInnis's points, his last point. So, Mr. McInnis, you spoke a lot about that in order to get Iran to the table on non-nuclear issues, use of proxies, missile program. You'd have to, I think, double, triple, quadruple the pressure we've previously used. Could you go into some specifics about, what that kind of overwhelming pressure would look like, to what extent some of that would come from the president, to what extent some of that would come from Congress? And then secondly, what can we expect in terms of Iranian behavior to test the incoming administration, to see, what its weaknesses are, how badly it's willing to prioritize concessions on the JCPOA and so forth? And that second question I would particularly address to all three of you. Thank you.
Yeah, like I said, I haven't figured out the whole suite of legislation that would be, and so forth that would take to bring them to the table on the missile and terrorism issues per se, mainly because, and actually, I mean, if you really want to get in, I think it would have to be, it's a mixture of pressure, but I think if you're really going to play the game on this, you almost have to play some of the things we used to do in the Cold War and do some, it's simply not pressure. You have to play some games as well. And some of that is competitive strategies with the Iranians, which is potentially encouraging and frankly messing with them to some degree, to get them to divest from those types of, if you feel those capabilities are very problematic, and you want to get them to stop doing that because it's a real problem that they sponsor terrorism, but they are still going to want, because they are a state, and they're going to want, it's impossible to stop a state, in my opinion, to find ways to deter its enemies. And it will see us as long as it believes we are the enemy, and it chooses to think that we are the enemy. That is an ideological choice, to see us as an enemy. And Israel, it's an ideological choice to decide that Israel is his enemy. There's no strategic reason for Israel to be Iran's enemy. It is an ideological choice. So if it chooses, Israel and the U.S. to be its enemy, and it is going to do things to deter that, and to have capability to hit Israel and to hit the U.S., then you have to, how do you want to make that less problematic for us? And you don't like terrorism, so do you want Iran to spend a whole bunch of money and waste a whole bunch of money on something like airplanes that we can deal with, that are easy for us to manage and defend against, and are very expensive, and they're never going to keep up with us? This is kind of the competitive strategies, net assessment approach that we used to use in the Cold War with the Soviets. And basically funnel their energy into less dangerous things than the things that we have, asymmetric stuff that's really frustrating for us and very dangerous for us to deal with. That is one of the things that we can explore. And I think actually the Iranians could be actually very susceptible to that. But it also requires continuing them to pursue things like terrorism and their missile program the way they are, making that very painful for them. So you have to make it painful to go down the bad path, but how do you make it encourage them in certain ways to go down a less painful path? Again, this is actually something we talk about with my old colleagues in the Pentagon and the intelligence community, about ways that could be done, but we're not quite there yet on a good strategy. What was your second question? I can let these guys talk too. I won't take the whole floor.
How the Iranians might misbehave in the coming months, where they're likely to test the new administration?
I can say quickly, I don't think the Iranians, I mentioned the crying wolf thing, they're actually going to hit a point, because the supreme leader during the nuclear negotiations cried wolf a lot, which I kept reminding, I used to write about this when he would say, do these red lines during the negotiations. It's like, no, we will absolutely have to have 10,000 centrifuges. And I said, no, he's going to bail on that one. He's going to give up on that one. And people were like, no, they get all freaked out about it. No, he says a lot of things that he has to back down on after a while. And they're going to cry wolf on several of these things. It's going to be interesting. They're going to eventually hit a point where if Congress really starts passing legislation and the president really does do some significant things, they are going to hit a point where they're going to have to retaliate in some way, symbolically at least, and then eventually maybe with something that does hurt. But they're not going to back away from the deal. It's going to take a lot for them to back away from the deal. At the same time, I actually expect they think Trump is an interesting character, and I don't think they want Trump to make the first move. They do not. I think if Secretary Clinton had been elected, they would have tested her first. But I think Trump, they want to let him take the first move, and then they're going to react to that.
So I really disagree with Matt. I think Khamenei drew those red lines and actually got most of the demands. For example, he asked for, I don't remember the number at this point, but it was, was it 10,000 centrifuges? It was probably more like 50,000 centrifuges. He's getting that. That's exactly what the sunset provisions are all about. Right. He just said, he never said, I want it today. He said, that's what I want. And he's actually going to get that certainly within a decade. So I think he's been very strategic at how he draws these red lines. I also think, this is where I also disagree with Matt, I think he's going to challenge the Trump administration right away. I think he can't help himself. I think the Iranians can't help themselves. I mean, every day they're committing egregious acts. I don't think that's going to stop. They may be a little bit more careful on the nuclear side. They may be a little more careful on blowing past the heavy water caps or the LEU caps. I know the administration is hard at work trying to renegotiate the JCPOA to kind of lower those caps so that the Iranians have a higher delta and that they don't provoke the Trump administration. But I think so they may be a little more careful. But remember, the Iranians on the nuclear side, the Iranians don't cheat egregiously. They cheat incrementally, even though the sum total of their incremental cheating ends up being egregious. That's the way they always play the nuclear side. And I think they'll continue to do that incrementally, but maybe a little bit more careful. Look, in terms of what the administration and Congress can do together, I think there's a number of things that we can do. I think we have to restore American coercion, and that's not just sanctions. I think we get obsessed with sanctions. I know I do, and I think Congress does too. And I think it's understandable. Sanctions play a role, but sanctions aren't a silver bullet, and they may be kind of silver shrapnel. They may wound a regime economically, and I think they did. And I think that they eventually got the Iranians to the table. But the goal is not to get the Iranians to the table, as Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen said. The goal is to actually have our own defined red lines and enforce those red lines in order to prevent the Iranians from developing a nuclear weapon. Right? We didn't cut off the pathways. We actually have expanded the pathways. We've given them a patient pathway. And so what could we do? Well, the next time a Revolutionary Guard attack boat harasses the U.S. Navy, we should sink it and put it at the bottom of the Gulf. I think that would be a good start. I think the new congressional legislation, which is authorizing the provision of man-pads in Syria, might be an interesting area to explore. Remember, right now Syria is a target-rich environment if you want to go after the Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah. And that's not just a hypothetical possibility. The Israelis are doing it today. And the Israelis are killing Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah commanders who are trying to set up bases of operation on the Syria-Israeli border in the Golan. Right? So the Israelis are doing it. The Israelis are bombing Hezbollah supply lines. There was another attack yesterday or today, second attack in a week. So the Israelis are enforcing their red lines. They're using military force against the Iranians. I think the United States of America could do the same, and we need to put that military option back on the table in a credible way, because if it's back on the table in a credible way, it opens up possibilities for us then to use non-military coercion. But if we don't have credible military force, and if we're not actually willing to apply it, then sanctions actually become quite a weak alternative to trying to restore that coercion on a host of different fronts. And so there's the opportunity for Congress and a new administration. Sanctions back on the table, military force back on the table. I think with Mike Pompeo at DCI, we may even see covert action back on the table. But I think this would be useful to push back against the Iranians and make it very clear to them, and I'll end with this, and that is that you're unhappy with the JCPOA. You didn't get the economic relief you wanted. Well, the reason you didn't get an economic relief you wanted is because banks today are not only afraid of U.S. non-nuclear sanctions, they're afraid of doing business with Iran because its financial sector is engaged in massive illicit finance, missiles and terrorism, shipments of arms, right? Those are things that make banks really, really nervous, whether or not we had sanctions. And so if the Iranians are going to actually see an economic bonanza from the JCPOA, then they've got to find a way to dial back their own malign activities in order to reassure the financial sector and the global commercial sector that this is a safer place to do business. And so I think that's where a negotiation can begin with the Iranians on a follow-on JCPOA, all the while making sure that we continue to use coercive instruments of American power so that they understand the alternative to a JCPOA to maybe the collapse of their economy and maybe the sinking of their Revolutionary Guard attack boats, or worse.
I'll be very brief because we should get to the Q&A. To me, the biggest change is the change that will come with the administration. And the fear and uncertainty, as Mark said earlier, FUD and doubt, that can be a tremendous element of power in diplomacy and international relations. Just think about it from the Iranian point of view. They've now come from a time when they were dealing with the P5+1, including the Obama administration, which they concluded wanted a nuclear agreement more than they wanted it, even though they needed it more than we needed it, and a P5+1, including the Obama administration, that clearly, once the agreement was negotiated, wanted to protect it to the extent of turning its eyes away from violations, or just as Mark has said, this is very painful to think about this, not doing some of the things we should have done on a humanitarian basis. Forget everything else in Syria for fear of offending the Iranians. So they're dealing now with uncertainty. You know, when you ask, and Alan, it's a good question, what might the Iranians do to misbehave, to challenge the new president? They're already misbehaving in so many different ways. It's hard to imagine what else they could do, but they might try. But I think what's going to happen is that, and I hope it happens, that President Trump and his administration will seriatim, really, and methodically challenge the Iranians and take some step early on, maybe a warning, just along. The president-elect said this during the campaign. He can make it explicit with the power he has as commander-in-chief, that if they challenge some of our naval assets, that we will fire on them. I mean, we've got to be that explicit. And there may be some other, particularly the idea that by executive order, President Trump can designate the entire IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization, not just the Quds Force. That will be a transformational act, and he can do it. So I expect that we will take, America now will be on the offensive, and they will have to react to it and react to the new reality that they're dealing with somebody quite different in the White House than for the last several years.
So at this point, we'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience. My colleague, Daniel Roth, in the corner over there, has a microphone. And please, when you ask the question, please identify your name and affiliation. And as always, please put your statement in the form of a question. Thanks.
Dan Pollock from the Zionist Organization of America. Thanks for a great program. I have tremendous respect for each of you up there. When we say renegotiate, I always personally hear provide some additional pressure on the Iranians, but I never expect them to actually accept a renegotiation. Are they ideologically capable of reopening that negotiation, even if it's in their best interest? And the other question that's related is, do we run a risk? The other thing that President-elect Trump has said is he doesn't want another war, as Matt alluded to in that region, do we have the potential of allowing their ideology to run away from them and get them to put us in a position where President-elect Trump could end up not following through on the best case scenario because he ends up fearing that Iran will choose war, even though it's irrational for them to do so?
Well, on the ideology issue, I mean, ideology provides a framework for much of their foreign policy. I mean, it certainly provides the framework for much of their internal government and structure, of course, but in the context of foreign policy, it on key points, it frames what they do, but they fundamentally, they can be, in the execution of it, they will be pragmatic when they need to be. Expediency always trumps ideology in the end for them. And there's a very clear, actually there's almost a doctrine of that internally that started with Khomeini, that because ultimately that they cannot have the revolution if the state does not exist. So the state has to be preserved, and that's why expediency has to be preserved over ideology in the end. So yes, if the renegotiation makes sense, then they will come to, and that's the reason why in the end I think coercion and pressure has to be there, but there has to be, in a certain sense, a logic to why they have to do it, unless there is overwhelming pressure and coercion. That's the reason why there has to be a certain kind of, oh, it makes sense for us to do this right now, which reason why I almost have trouble believing that there's not going to be some form of incentives or other logic for them to have renegotiation, and what that is, I don't know.
So really, for the duration, I think a lot of people who follow this closely have said that the obtaining of nuclear weapons is really the priority goal for Ayatollah Khamenei. That in some sense, Khomeini achieved the revolution, and now his contribution to their history, and unfortunately he's contributed in many other ways that are negative to us, will be to give them nuclear weapons which will make them the regional and world power they want to be, the dominant regional power. And the caveat on all that, and all the discussions I've had with people who spend a lot of time at this, and it makes sense to me, to a certain extent Matt just said it, is that the only thing, the only value or goal that is greater than the goal of gaining nuclear weapons is the survival of the regime itself. And I think we had them at a point before these negotiations began with the economic sanctions, impact on the economy, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of unrest in Iran. I mean, as you all know, not the time to talk about a lot of different ethnic groups besides the Persians, a lot of young people disenchanted, et cetera, that they were beginning to wonder. We're at a disadvantage, notwithstanding all of the hopes that people like me have expressed this morning about the change of administrations and President Trump coming in with a clear-eyed negative view of the Iranian regime. Nonetheless, they now have those billions of dollars. They are stronger. They've developed this relationship with Russia. So I think in various ways we have to begin to put pressure back on them to lead them to begin to wonder about the survival of the regime in all the ways that we've mentioned here. And we also have to give them incentives. And look, we have a priority goal ourselves. I'm speaking now for UANI, but I'm speaking for myself. It is to renegotiate the agreement so they forswear nuclear weapons capacity forever. Now, we know the difficulty of keeping the Iranians to their word, but that's the kind of agreement. Would I like them to also agree to stop the repression, stop the support of terrorism? Well, that of course. But that's the priority goal, and then the question for us is, what are we willing to offer them in return for that? And that's a tough negotiation, and that's a negotiation, honestly, in which at least this Ayatollah and anybody I see who would the likely replacements for him, they would really have to feel again that the survival of the regime may well be and question to get to that point. So that, notwithstanding all of our hopefulness this morning, that's how tough this one is.
And I'll just make a quick point here, just a little bit of history. Yes, our sanctions were biting the Iranian economy in 2013. They were 4 to 6 months away from a severe balance of payments crisis. We obviously know the history, reduced the leverage, we blocked congressional legislation on new sanctions. They were able to recover. Their economy is now expected to have 4 or 5% growth. But I think it's also worth remembering a few things. One is our allies multilateralized our powerful secondary sanctions, because they feared the sanctions and the impact on their companies. But more than that, they feared Israeli military strikes. And when you gave the French and the Germans and the Brits and everyone else a fundamental choice between joining our sanctions regime or permitting the Israelis to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, they opted for sanctions. That was the fundamental reason. We need to restore that fear and reanimate that fear in the capitals of Europe and Asia. And the other thing to remember is that the Iranians do fear American military power. It is worth remembering, too, that at the end of the day, after 8 years and over 1 million deaths in the Iran-Iraq war, it was in a major incident involving the United States where the USS Vinson accidentally took down an Iranian passenger airline. Right? And Khomeini couldn't believe that the United States had made such an error. And he believed that this was an indication the United States was going to intervene on behalf of Saddam. And it was actually Khamenei and Rafsanjani who went to Khomeini and said, we can't fight the Americans. And they sued for peace. It's also worth remembering that, the tanker wars in 1988, when they were harassing tankers through the Gulf, the U.S. Navy, put some Iranian ships again at the bottom of the Gulf. And that sent a message, stop harassing international shipping. Again, the application of American power. So the application, or at least the credible threat of American power, has the ability to not only, I think, give pause to the Iranians, but also to convince our allies that there is a better alternative to the use of military force, and that is the application of economic pressure and a return to a dual-track process, or dual-track diplomacy that the administration followed, of pressure and diplomacy with a view to a follow-on agreement, right? Let's not talk about renegotiating this agreement. Let's talk about negotiating a follow-on agreement, perfectly consistent with ample precedent in the Cold War that addresses the fundamental flaws of this agreement, both for us and for the Iranians, who again are not getting the economic relief that they believe they'd get.
Talked about is nuclear sanctions, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the incoming president, has to reaffirmatively lift the sanctions that are still on the books, right? And so, because that way, if there's a violation of the JCPOA, he can obviously reimpose these sanctions, these nuclear sanctions. You all here are clearly think that the deal is a bad deal, so would you advise President Trump, given the technical violations that we've already seen and that have been reported, to just go ahead and do that? Don't, reimpose some of these nuclear sanctions.
Sure. So what you're talking about, Julian, is that every 120 to 180 days, the president has to waive the statutory sanctions that are still on the books. And I lost track of the calendar, but it's going to come up perhaps pretty early in his administration, whether he decides to continue to waive those sanctions. So my advice to the president would be make sure that you have a menu of nuclear sanctions. Right? Don't publicize them, because if you publicize them, the Iranians will know what the penalties are, and then they will calculate, are we willing to sustain those penalties in order to incrementally advance our nuclear program. So have a private, confidential list shared with relevant committees of Congress, a whole menu of nuclear sanctions to respond to Iranian violations, and a zero tolerance on Iranian violations. Like, you're 1 kilogram over on LEU or on heavy water, and we will use U.S. nuclear sanctions to respond to that. If those violations continue, if they're incremental, but the sum total then becomes egregious, then you use your authority to not waive nuclear statutory sanctions, and or you invoke Article 37 of the JCPOA and you move to snap back the UN sanctions. But the first step out of the gate is a menu of U.S. nuclear sanctions to respond to incremental Iranian cheating and a zero-tolerance policy on those incremental violations. That would be a dramatic reversal from what we've seen under this administration.
Questions? Sarah?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Two questions. One is President Obama was rather wise in that he made the United States just one party in the P5+1. We can do everything. What about all the other parties involved? And the second question is, in 2009, when we had millions of Iranians on the streets after the sham elections, we had a wonderful opportunity that was wasted. Is there any way that we can telegraph to the young dissidents in Iran that, yes, we can be with them once again, much as we used the Soviet Jewish movement during the Cold War?
Those are two great questions. I'll do the second one. Talk about raising within the mind of the leaders of the regime in Tehran the concern about the survival of the regime. Clearly, one of the things they most fear is their own people if there's a real movement to rise up. I gathered within the last couple of days there was the annual Students' Day, and there were a lot of students protesting. Elections are coming up, of course, next June, and it was after the elections in June of 2009 when there was an uprising which we turned our eyes and ears away from. So I think there is a moment of opportunity here for the new administration in the various ways in which it can send messages out. On the first question about the P5+1, I don't know if we can say that our P5+1 allies are also, they're suffering from their own form of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the new administration, and that's not bad either across quite a range of our relations, beginning, of course, with NATO, which President-elect has been very explicit about. So we'll see. I mean, it's not easy because the others in the P5+1 are seem to be at least as committed to the Iran nuclear agreement as the U.S. administration has been, even though at times France seemed quite much more aggressive at times in the negotiations than we are, and who knows what the French elections will bring next year. So I would say that would be one element. That's why I say I would begin, if I were the new administration, with our Arab and Israeli allies. And then I'd go back to the P5+1 and talk about, okay, what are we going to do with Iran now? Because, hey, you may not like it, but Donald Trump is now the president of the United States, and he has a very different attitude toward Iran than President Barack Obama did.
So I just wanted to answer the first question. Again, it's worth looking at precedent, right? So, and I think Senator Lieberman probably remembers this, but during the Clinton administration reached the Chemical Weapons Convention. I can't remember the exact number of countries, but it was over 80 countries, including Iran. And at that time, the Clinton administration submitted the Chemical Weapons Convention as a treaty, right, for the advice and consent of the Senate. And the Senate came back and said, we're not going to ratify the CWC unless you get the following dozen or 24 changes to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the Clinton administration said, look, we just concluded a multilateral negotiation with over 80 countries, including Iran, all of whom have agreed to sign on to the Chemical Weapons Convention. You want us to go back and renegotiate a multilateral agreement with over 80 countries? And the Senate said, we do. And here are the changes we are required. So the Clinton administration sighed and went back and renegotiated and got the majority of those provisions and requested changes, and the Senate ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention. So the idea that we have never renegotiated multilateral agreements, arms control agreements, again, is just false. We have, right? We've renegotiated bilateral treaties with the Soviet Union when they had nuclear-tipped missiles aimed at our cities. We've renegotiated multilateral agreements like the Chemical Weapons Convention. We walked away from the ABM Treaty, because we believe the ABM treaty was overly restrictive in our ability to protect the United States and our allies, and we did that without major consequence. It didn't end up in a war. We've done this. This is not a treaty. So, I mean, I'm not recommending this course of action, but maybe a Trump administration goes and submits the JCPOA as a treaty. And maybe the Senate says, we would ratify this, but we request the following changes. Sunset provision, physical inspections of military sites, restrictions on their long-range ballistic missile program. Here is, a dozen changes that we request, and says to the Trump administration, go renegotiate the JCPOA, and if you do, then we will ratify this treaty, and then it will be a durable bipartisan treaty. Right? So, unfortunately, for the Obama administration, you rule by the pen and the phone, you die by the pen and the phone, and that has been the greatest weakness of the JCPOA in terms of its process, is that the administration truly believed they could circumvent Congress, right, and they could circumvent the American people, and they could go do an agreement with 500 countries, and then they could bind us through a UN Security Council resolution, which, as Senator Lieberman says, Iran is currently violating the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 in terms of arms shipments, in terms of missile tests. So I think, again, this is not without precedent, and we have to keep the history of U.S. arms control in mind as we start to think through what are the possibilities, and not think this is some, unique sui generis moment where all of a sudden we're talking about negotiating some important agreements, and God forbid we did that because our allies are going to be upset. And I would just confirm the French view of this deal. The French are horrified by this deal. They will not tell you that publicly, but they were horrified by this deal because the deal backed away from fundamental demands, as Congressman Engel said, including on inspections and including on the possible military dimensions of this program, which, by the way, would be another requested change by a Senate seeking changes to the deal. Is we still haven't gotten the 12 fundamental questions that the IAEA has on Iran's PMD program answered. We didn't interview the scientists, we didn't see the documentation, we didn't go to the sites. We just kind of whitewashed this thing as we moved through to this nuclear deal and said, don't worry, their weaponization, experimentation, that's the past. We're looking forward. Well, it's not the past, because that's the whole point, is we want to know what was done, who did it, and we want to make sure that we have access to those sites and those scientists to ensure that they don't engage in weaponization in the future.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists for coming. Thank you to all of you for attending. And in particular, I'd like to thank our congressional staff guests. We look forward to working with you in the future on this issue. And thanks again to our co-hosts, the Foreign Policy Initiative, for sponsoring this event. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alan. Let me echo the thanks, and really the future is now up to us, with more reason to be encouraged than before, including particularly the congressional staff, which plays such a large role. I couldn't end and be true to the memory and legacy that I inherited from my beloved mother without telling you that there are sandwiches over there. Yeah, and there is a free lunch today if you choose to take it. Take care.